You have 10 minutes to open that gate, or we will open it ourselves. That was the first thing Linda Mercer said to me at 6:17 on a Tuesday morning, while 30 private security guards stood across my driveway with tools in their hands. I looked at the gate, then at the woman who had spent 3 years calling herself the voice of our neighborhood. Linda was the president of our HOA, but that morning she was acting like she owned the road leading to my property. I did not raise my voice. I did not step toward her. I simply asked one question. What document gives you permission to enter my property? Linda held up a folder. The HOA access authorization. I asked her to show me the recorded easement. She paused. That pause told me more than the folder did. My name is Ethan Carter, and I had owned this property for more than 20 years. The gate was not decorative. It marked the entrance to my private driveway, and the property behind it was recorded under my deed. I had dealt with HOA complaints before, but this was different. 30 people had arrived before sunrise, and someone had already decided that my permission was unnecessary. I stepped back into the house and called Daniel Brooks, the attorney I had used for property matters. I told him exactly what I was seeing. He asked me one question. Do not confront them. Do you still have the original survey? I told him I did. I opened the cabinet where I kept my property records and pulled out the survey, the deed, and an old title report. The survey showed my boundary clearly. The gate stood several feet inside my property line. There was no community access corridor crossing it. Daniel told me to photograph every document and send him copies. While I was doing that, Linda called through the gate. She said the HOA had received an updated access map and that the work needed to be completed that morning. I asked why the work was so urgent. Her answer stopped me. The developer has a closing scheduled in 48 hours. That was information I had never heard before. I had no idea why a developer's closing had anything to do with my gate. Daniel called back less than 5 minutes later. He had reviewed the survey. Ethan, your property line is clear, he said. But I found something else. The HOA document you mentioned references a county record number. I wrote the number down. Then I searched it in my property records. It was not attached to my deed. It was not an easement. It was a separate filing connected to a development application. Suddenly, the 30 guards made more sense. They were not there because the HOA had discovered a violation. They were there because someone needed my gate opened before a deadline. I walked back outside and looked through the gate at Linda. She was still holding the folder. You have 10 minutes, she repeated. I looked at my watch. Then I looked at the county record number Daniel had given me. For the first time that morning, I wondered whether the HOA president even understood what was written in the document she was using against me. I had the original survey in my hands. They had 30 people outside my gate. And somewhere in the county records was the reason they were suddenly so desperate to get through it. The county record number was the first clue that the HOA was not acting alone. I called Daniel Brooks again and read it to him exactly as it appeared on the authorization Linda Mercer had shown me. He told me to wait while he searched the county database. I stood at the kitchen counter with my original survey spread open beside me, listening to the distant movement outside my gate. The 30 guards were still there, but nobody was touching anything. That gave me time to understand what we were actually dealing with. 10 minutes had become an hour, and Linda had stopped repeating her demand. Daniel called back with a document number and a warning. Ethan, this is not an HOA property record, he said. It is connected to a development application. I opened the county website and found the filing. It was a preliminary access plan submitted by Ridgeway Estates Development Group. The drawing showed a proposed route running along the edge of my property, but the line stopped before reaching my gate. Then Daniel sent me the revised version. The difference was obvious. Someone had extended the route directly to my gate and labeled the area as community access. I asked Daniel whether a planning application could give the HOA permission to enter my land. He said it could not. A proposed map was not the same thing as a recorded easement, and a development application could not change the boundary listed on my deed. That answered one question, but it created another. Why had the HOA brought 30 guards to my property before obtaining the legal right they claimed to have? I called the county planning office and requested the submission history. The clerk told me the original application had been filed several weeks earlier, while the revised access drawing had been submitted much later. I asked who submitted the revision. She told me the record showed Linda Mercer acting on behalf of the HOA. I wrote that down. Then I asked who had requested the revision. The clerk said the supporting correspondence would have to be reviewed separately. Daniel told me not to contact the developer yet. He wanted every record preserved first. I followed his advice and photographed the county screen, the survey, the deed, and the HOA authorization. Outside, one of the security supervisors approached the gate and asked whether I had any updated instructions. I told him I was still reviewing the documents. He said his company had been given a written authorization packet by the HOA. I asked whether that packet contained a recorded easement. He checked the folder and shook his head. No, sir. It contains an HOA resolution and an access map. That was the first confirmation from someone outside the HOA that their authority rested on those two documents. I thanked him and stepped back inside. Daniel called again. He had found the developer agreement. Ridgeway Estates was preparing to close on a major project in 48 hours, and the agreement required a confirmed access route before closing. But one sentence caught Daniel's attention. The agreement required written approval from any private property owner whose land would be used for access. My name was not on the agreement. My signature was nowhere in the file. That meant the HOA had not simply misunderstood my property rights. Someone had tried to solve the developer's deadline without getting my permission. Then Daniel found one more record. A payment authorization had been issued to a private security company for $30,000, with another $30,000 scheduled if the site operation continued. The authorization date was the same week the revised access map was submitted. I looked through the window at the 30 guards outside my gate. Suddenly, their presence was no longer the biggest question. The real question was who had decided that $30,000 was worth spending before anyone had verified whether the HOA had the right to be there at all. By the time the 48-hour deadline became real, I knew the gate was only the visible part of the problem. The documents showed that the developer needed access, the HOA had tried to provide it, and 30 private security guards had been sent to my property before anyone had confirmed the legal basis for that plan. What I did not know was who had approved the money. Daniel Brooks found that answer before noon. The $30,000 payment authorization had been signed by Thomas Whitaker, one of the HOA board members. Thomas was not a stranger to the development project. His name appeared on several HOA communications concerning Ridgeway Estates. That connection did not prove anything improper, but it gave us another question that needed an answer. Why was an HOA board member authorizing private security for property the HOA had not established ownership over? Daniel told me to request the complete board minutes from the week the payment was approved. I submitted the request through the HOA's official records process. While we waited, I reviewed the developer agreement again. One sentence stood out more clearly than before. Ridgeway Estates needed access confirmation before its closing could proceed. The agreement did not say the HOA already possessed that access. It said the access arrangement was expected to be completed. That difference mattered. Someone had taken an expected future agreement and treated it as if it were already in place. I called Daniel and read the sentence to him. He agreed. That may be the assumption everything else was built on, he said. Then the HOA records arrived. The board minutes showed that Thomas had asked a direct question before the security contract was approved. He wanted to know whether the disputed strip belonged to the HOA or to the adjacent homeowner. The answer came from Linda Mercer. According to the minutes, she said the developer had confirmed that the area could be used for access and that the board should proceed with preparations. I read the sentence twice. The developer had confirmed access. That was not the same as the developer proving ownership. Daniel pointed out another detail. The minutes did not show a recorded easement being presented to the board. There was no survey attached to the authorization. There was no signed agreement from me. Yet the payment had been approved anyway. I printed the minutes and placed them beside my deed and certified survey. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The HOA had a deadline. The developer had a deadline. The board had an access map. But none of those things created a legal right over my property. Then Linda called me. Her tone was noticeably different from that morning. She said the board wanted to resolve the situation quickly and asked whether I would consider signing a temporary access agreement. I asked why I should sign an agreement for a right they had already claimed to possess. She said the developer's closing depended on cooperation. I told her I was willing to review any legitimate proposal, but I would not sign something simply because someone else had created a deadline. There was silence on the phone. Then Linda said, "If the closing fails, everyone in this community will be affected." I answered calmly, "Then the people who planned the closing should make sure the paperwork is correct." After we ended the call, Daniel sent me another message. He had checked the county submission history one more time. The revised access map had been uploaded just 3 days before the security contract was approved. And the person who uploaded it had used an HOA account that was registered directly to Linda Mercer. We now had the map, the payment, the board minutes, and the developer deadline. But we still did not know why Linda was willing to risk the entire HOA's credibility over one narrow strip of my property. Daniel thought he had found the answer. He told me to look at the last page of the developer agreement, where the closing conditions were listed. There was one condition neither of us had noticed before. The last page of the developer agreement changed the entire situation. Daniel Brooks had found the clause while reviewing the closing conditions, and when he read it to me over the phone, I understood why Linda Mercer had been pushing so hard. Ridgeway Estates did not simply want an access route. The developer needed written confirmation that the route would remain available before its financing could be finalized. My gate was sitting directly in the path of the revised plan, and that made my property the missing piece in someone else's deadline. I asked Daniel whether the agreement gave the developer any authority over my land. He said no. It created an obligation between the parties who signed it, but it could not replace my consent or create an easement that had never been recorded. That distinction was important. The HOA had not discovered a right. It had tried to satisfy a condition. I looked again at the revised map Linda had brought to my property. The line had been moved just far enough to connect the development route to my gate. It was a small change on paper, but it had enormous consequences. Daniel told me to preserve everything and avoid signing anything until the county records had been reviewed. I agreed. Then I made one more call. I contacted the county planning office and requested the complete submission history for the revised access map. The clerk told me the file included a digital upload, supporting correspondence, and an authorization statement from the HOA. I asked whether the county had ever received a recorded easement from the HOA. The answer was immediate. No recorded easement appeared in the file. That gave us something stronger than an argument. We had a missing document where the HOA's entire position required one to exist. I printed the county response and placed it beside my deed, survey, and the developer agreement. Then Daniel noticed another detail. The authorization statement described the disputed strip as community access property. But my certified survey did not use that description, and neither did the county's original parcel record. Daniel said the phrase appeared to have been introduced only in the revised HOA paperwork. That meant the language itself had a history. Someone had changed not only the line on the map, but the way the property was being described. Before we could investigate further, Linda arrived at my driveway with 2 board members. She asked to speak privately. I met them outside the gate. Linda said the board was willing to compensate me for temporary access. I asked what legal document established the HOA's right to request that access. She said the board had acted based on the development agreement and the revised map. I told her either document carried my signature. One board member looked at Linda and quietly asked whether the county had confirmed the access route. Linda did not answer. That was the first time I saw uncertainty inside the HOA itself. I told them I was willing to review a lawful proposal, but I would not approve temporary access simply because a developer had a deadline. Linda finally said the closing was now less than 48 hours away. I nodded. Then the paperwork should be ready, I said. They left without another demand. Daniel called moments later. He had just received a notification from the county. An official review had been opened after the conflicting maps were flagged. Then he said something that made me look toward the road. Ethan, county officials are coming to your property. I asked when. He answered, they are already on the way. The black SUVs arrived before I had time to put the county response into a folder, and the first thing I noticed was that none of them belonged to the HOA. 3 vehicles turned slowly onto the street and stopped near the entrance to my property while the 30 private security personnel waited beside the gate. Linda Mercer stood several yards away, still holding the same folder she had used that morning. I stepped onto the porch with my phone in my hand. Daniel Brooks had already sent the county my deed, certified survey, revised access map, board minutes, and payment authorization. I did not know whether the people arriving had seen all of it. Then a county property official stepped out of the first vehicle. A county sheriff followed. The official introduced himself as Mark Reynolds and asked whether I was Ethan Carter. I said yes. He looked toward the gate, and then toward Linda. We received documentation concerning a disputed access route, he said. We are here to verify the recorded property information. That sentence changed the atmosphere immediately. The guards stopped preparing their equipment. Nobody was asked to leave yet. Nobody was accused of anything. The county was simply checking the records. Mark asked Linda whether the HOA had a recorded easement covering my gate. She opened her folder and produced the access authorization. Mark read it carefully. Then he asked for the recorded easement. Linda said the HOA had an access map. Mark repeated the question. I am asking for the recorded easement. Linda looked toward one of the board members who had arrived with her. He did not answer. Mark turned to me and asked for my survey. I handed him the certified copy Daniel had told me to keep available. He compared it with the county parcel record on his tablet. The boundary matched. The gate was inside my property line. The access route shown on the original county drawing stopped before reaching it. Mark then asked to see the revised map. Linda handed it over. He placed the 2 drawings side by side. The difference was small enough to miss if someone looked quickly, but obvious when the lines were compared carefully. The revised route extended across my property. Mark asked who had submitted the revision. Linda said the HOA had submitted it based on information provided for the development project. Mark asked whether the HOA had obtained written permission from me. Linda said the board believed the access arrangement was already covered by the development process. Mark did not argue with her. He simply wrote something into his notes. Then he asked the security supervisor whether the company had been given a recorded easement. The supervisor checked his authorization packet and said no. He had received an HOA resolution, an access map, and instructions to provide site presence. Mark looked back at Linda. Then the access right has not been established in the county records, he said. That was the first official statement anyone had made that morning. Linda immediately said the matter was still being reviewed and that the developer had a closing deadline. Mark answered that a private closing deadline did not change the recorded property boundary. I watched Linda's expression change. For the first time, she was no longer speaking as though the paperwork had already settled the issue. Daniel called me while the county officials were still reviewing the file. I answered and put him on speaker. He asked whether the county had arrived. I said yes. Daniel paused for a moment. Then he told me he had received one more document from the developer. Ethan, they just sent us the original access agreement, he said. There is a condition in it that explains why they needed your gate so badly. I looked at Linda, then at the county officials. Daniel continued. And your written approval is required before the developer can satisfy that condition. Daniel's words made the entire morning fall into place. The developer did not simply want access to my property. They needed my written approval to satisfy a condition before the closing could move forward. That meant the HOA had been trying to solve someone else's deadline without first obtaining the one thing they actually needed from me. I asked Daniel to send the agreement directly to Mark Reynolds, the county official standing beside my gate. Within minutes, Mark was reading the same clause from his tablet. He looked at Linda Mercer and asked whether the HOA had ever obtained my written approval. Linda said the board had expected to resolve the matter through the access arrangement. Mark asked again whether I had signed anything. I said no. That answer was simple, but it carried more weight now because the original agreement was part of the county review. Mark explained that a private development agreement could establish obligations between its parties, but it could not create property rights that were absent from the recorded land documents. I could see the security supervisor listening carefully. He had arrived that morning believing the HOA had authorized legitimate site work. Now he was learning that the authorization depended on an access right nobody could produce. I asked Daniel what the payment records meant. He said we needed to follow the money without making assumptions. He had already requested the complete HOA financial record connected to the security contract. A few minutes later, he sent me a copy. The first $30,000 had been approved by the board. The second $30,000 was conditional on the site operation continuing. The authorization had been issued before the county received the revised map. That detail mattered. The HOA had committed money before confirming the property rights it claimed to be enforcing. Mark reviewed the payment record and asked Linda who had recommended the security company. Linda said the developer had provided the contact information. Mark wrote that down. Then he asked who had approved the revised map. Linda said the HOA board had reviewed it. Thomas Whitaker, the board member who had signed the payment authorization, finally spoke. He said he believed the developer had already confirmed the access arrangement. Mark asked whether Thomas had personally reviewed a recorded easement before approving the contract. Thomas hesitated. He admitted he had not. That admission changed the room. The 30 guards were still outside, but their role had become almost irrelevant. The real story was now sitting inside a stack of documents. Daniel called again and told me he had found something else in the developer file. The closing condition did not merely require access. It required confirmation that the access route was legally available before the closing date. The revised HOA map had been created to make that condition appear satisfied. I looked at Linda. She had spent the morning insisting the HOA had authority over my gate. Now the county record showed that authority had never been established. Mark told everyone that no access work should proceed until the property records and the development agreement were reconciled. The security supervisor immediately told his team to stand down and wait for further instructions. Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. Then Daniel sent me one final page. It was an internal developer correspondence dated 3 days before the revised map was submitted. The message mentioned my property by parcel number and said, "Owner approval remains the outstanding condition." I read that sentence twice. The developer had known from the beginning that my approval was missing. Yet 3 days later, the HOA submitted a new map, approved a $60,000 security operation, and sent 30 people to my gate. I looked at the county official and asked what happened next. Mark answered calmly. "Now we determine who represented that the access right already existed." The sentence about owner approval stayed on my screen while Mark Reynolds reviewed the county file. "Owner approval remains the outstanding condition." There was no ambiguity in those words. The developer knew my signature was missing. The HOA knew the access route crossed my property. Yet 30 security personnel had still been sent to my gate. I asked Daniel Brooks what he wanted me to do next. His answer was simple. "Do nothing except preserve the records." I followed his advice. Mark requested the original developer correspondence, the revised map, the HOA authorization, and the board minutes. Linda Mercer handed over the documents without arguing. For the first time that day, she seemed more interested in what the records said than in defending the HOA's position. Thomas Whitaker remained nearby. Mark asked him why the board had approved the security contract if the developer correspondence clearly showed that owner approval was still missing. Thomas said he believed the access issue was administrative, and would be resolved before the closing. Mark asked who had told him that. Thomas looked toward Linda. Linda said the developer had indicated that the route was expected to be approved. Mark asked whether expected to be approved meant already legally established. Linda did not answer. Daniel then sent me the complete board minutes from the meeting where the security contract was approved. One line changed my understanding of Thomas's role. Before voting, Thomas had asked whether the homeowner had been contacted. The minutes recorded Linda's response. The homeowner will be approached after site preparation begins. I read the sentence slowly. They had planned to begin the operation first, and ask me later. That explained the confidence behind the morning's demand. They were not waiting for my approval. They were hoping the pressure of 30 people at my gate would make approval feel inevitable. I felt angry, but I kept my voice calm when Mark asked whether I had ever been contacted about access before that morning. I told him the HOA had sent ordinary violation notices in the past, but I had never received a request for temporary development access. Mark added that statement to his report. Then Daniel found another document. It was an email from the developer's project manager to Linda, dated 2 days before the revised map was submitted. The email said the closing team needed a clean access confirmation, and asked the HOA to coordinate with the affected homeowner. Linda had replied that the HOA would handle the matter. There was no mention of a recorded easement because there was none. There was no mention of my consent because they did not have it. The plan had been built around the assumption that the HOA could deliver access. Mark told Linda that the county would document the discrepancy and review the submission history. The security company was instructed to remain inactive until the matter was resolved. The developer's 48-hour deadline was now approaching fast. Daniel called me again. He had one more discovery. Ridgeway Estates had another possible access route, but using it would require redesigning part of the development plan. That meant my gate was not the only option. It was simply the fastest option. I looked at the 30 guards standing quietly beside the driveway. Hours earlier, they had been presented as proof that the HOA had authority. Now they were evidence that the HOA had acted before confirming its authority. Linda finally approached me and asked whether I would meet with the board that evening. I told her I would listen to any lawful proposal. She nodded. Then Mark received a call from the county office. He listened for several seconds before turning toward me. Mr. Carter, there is another issue, he said. The revised access map may not have been the only document changed. The county official's warning changed everything again. The revised access map may not have been the only document changed. I asked what he meant, and Mark Reynolds said the county had found 2 versions of another filing. One described the disputed strip as private residential property. The later version described it as community access. The difference was not a formatting mistake. It changed the meaning of the property record. Daniel Brooks asked the county to send him both versions, and within minutes he confirmed that the earlier document matched my certified survey. The later document had appeared shortly before the security contract was approved. I asked who had submitted it. Mark said the county record showed an HOA account, but the supporting information pointed toward a document prepared for Ridgeway Estates. That connection was the missing piece. The developer had needed access confirmation, the HOA had promised to provide it, and someone had altered the paperwork to make the route look established before my approval was obtained. I did not want to assume more than the records proved, so Daniel told me to let the county finish its review. That evening, I attended the emergency HOA meeting. Linda Mercer sat at the front table with Thomas Whitaker and the other board members. The mood was completely different from that morning. There were no guards outside the room. There were no demands at my gate. There were only documents spread across the table. Linda opened the meeting by saying the board had acted in what it believed was the community's best interest. I asked whether the board had known my written approval was required. Thomas answered first. He admitted that he had seen the developer correspondence but believed the access issue would be resolved before the closing. Daniel placed a copy of that correspondence on the table. The sentence about owner approval was highlighted. Then he placed the original county survey beside the revised map. The room became quiet. One board member asked Linda why the revised map described my property as community access. Linda said she had relied on information provided during the development process. Daniel asked whether she had ever received a recorded easement. She said no. That answer finally removed the last uncertainty. The HOA had been operating on an assumption, not a recorded property right. Then Thomas asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Why did we authorize $30,000 before verifying the easement? Linda looked down at the documents. She said the developer had emphasized the 48-hour closing deadline. Daniel then produced the developer email stating that owner approval was still outstanding. The board members read it silently. Their own records showed they knew approval was missing before the security contract was approved. The board voted to suspend the access authorization immediately. The security company contract was placed on hold, and the revised map was withdrawn from further use while the county completed its review. It was the first formal decision that actually matched the recorded property documents. But before the meeting ended, Linda received a call from Ridgeway Estates. She listened, then put the phone down slowly. The developer had another proposal. They wanted to avoid using my property entirely. But there was a problem. Their alternate route required changing the development plan before the closing deadline. Thomas looked at me and asked whether I would cooperate with a lawful alternative. I told him I would review anything that respected the recorded boundaries. Then Mark called Daniel with the county's latest update. The original access route was still available, but the developer would have to redesign part of the project. The gate was no longer the obstacle. The real obstacle was the paperwork they had tried to avoid. And with less than 24 hours remaining, everyone finally had to deal with the route that should have been considered from the beginning. By sunrise, the gate was exactly where it had always been, but everything around it had changed. Less than 24 hours remained before the Ridgeway Estates closing deadline, and the developer had finally accepted that my property could not be treated as a shortcut. I stood on my porch while the county officials reviewed the corrected records with Daniel Brooks. The original survey, the deed, and the county parcel record all agreed. My gate was on my property. The disputed access route was not a community right. It was a proposed route that someone had tried to make look permanent. Mark Reynolds told me the county had completed its preliminary review and would preserve both versions of the disputed documents in the record. That mattered to me more than any apology. A mistake could be corrected, but a record should tell the truth about what had actually happened. By mid-morning, Ridgeway Estates submitted a revised site plan using the alternate route. It required additional planning work, but it did not require my property. The developer's closing team confirmed that the project could move forward after the revised access plan was accepted. The 48-hour deadline had not disappeared. It had simply stopped being my problem. At the emergency HOA meeting that afternoon, Linda Mercer stood before the board and formally withdrew the access authorization. She acknowledged that the HOA had acted without a recorded easement, and that the security contract had been approved before the property rights were verified. Thomas Whitaker supported the withdrawal. He also requested an internal review of the $30,000 payment and the circumstances surrounding the revised map. No one mentioned sending another group to my property. No one asked me to sign a rush agreement. Instead, the board voted to correct the HOA records and notify residents that the disputed strip was private property. Daniel handed me a copy of the resolution afterward. I read it carefully. The language was finally accurate. There was no community access claim attached to my gate. There was no assumption that a developer's deadline created a right. There was simply a record of what the HOA had learned and what it had agreed to correct. Linda approached me after the meeting. She looked tired, but her voice was calm. She apologized for the way the situation had been handled. I told her I appreciated the apology, but the important thing was that the records now matched the property boundaries. She nodded. Then she admitted something that explained the pressure behind the entire situation. The board had believed that if the access route was not confirmed before the closing, the development would be delayed and the HOA would face pressure from the developer and residents. They had treated speed as more important than verification. That decision had brought 30 guards to my gate, committed $60,000 in potential security costs, and created a dispute that could have been avoided by checking one county record first. I drove home that evening and stood beside the gate for a moment. It looked ordinary again. No security personnel. No folders. No arguments. Just the same quiet entrance I had protected with paperwork instead of confrontation. Daniel called and told me the developer had received approval to continue with the alternate route. I thanked him and closed the gate. The whole situation had started with someone assuming they could move my boundary because they had a deadline. It ended with the boundary exactly where the county records said it had always been. I never needed to overpower anyone. I only needed to keep the original documents, ask the right questions, and let the official records speak for themselves.